Well, I'm happy to welcome all of you to our Teacher Data Task Force meeting today. Thank you for being here. Very grateful to all of the members of the task force who are spending their time doing this work together with us. And big welcome to the public and all of you from the community who are joining us as well. We're glad you're here. I'll cover just a few process things and then we'll jump right in. So task force members, wherever possible, please unmute yourself and speak your comments. If you type a comment into the chat, we'll pause periodically to read the chat comments aloud. And for community members, you're invited to submit public comment in advance of the meetings at the email address that we have here on the screen. And you can also make comments via chat during the meeting. And our team is renaming the task force members' handles with an A at the beginning. This helps with the alphabetization in Zoom, and that helps us to more easily identify input from our task force. So that's what we have in process to start. I'll take just a few minutes now to outline our goals for today's meeting and a couple of big picture points. And then I'm very grateful to Kathy, who I've asked to facilitate this task force and these meetings, who will then walk us through the questions in more depth. So the first thing we'll do this morning is to clarify the purpose of the task force and revisit it. Wanted to also say, thank you for your patience with us needing to have to cancel the last meeting. So we're going to picking up where we left off a month ago. We'll review a revised format for identifying data points that we think might be more easy to digest and navigate. We'll evaluate data points for the following topics. So teacher preparation, teacher credentials, and student characteristics. And then our final goal is to determine how we can best finalize agency level definitions for data points that are not yet defined. So those are the overarching goals for today's meeting. So let's take a minute now to remind ourselves why we convened this task force and what the work of the task force is. So the purpose of the task force is to provide input to the Office of Cradle-to-Career Data for consideration in the development of the Cradle-to-Career analytical data set. And the task force is to recommend ways to calculate data points related to teacher preparation programs, teacher credentialing, teacher placement, and teacher retention data for this planned dashboard that we have on teacher training and retention. So the overall dashboard is going to look at those topics. And to do that, the recommendations that we're looking to this task force to develop is around finalizing the list of data points necessary to answer the research questions. So that's asking, given this research question that was identified and that we want to answer, what list of data points will be necessary to be able to do that? And then documenting options for calculating each metric based on the prior experience of the state agencies and researchers, and then working together to select the best option for each data point. So in addition to our time here in this meeting, we will also work directly with task force members to compile information on existing data definitions to inform the discussion. And the reason that we're doing this work now in parallel with Cradle-to-Career, working on the initial build of the data system, is that we need to identify what these data points will be so that our participation agreement that we've signed with all of the different data partners that we have at Cradle-to-Career can be amended to include data points that were not already specified for the P20W data set. Again, P20W is the shorthand for the list of 200 or so data points that were already identified in our participation agreement. So that's part of why we're doing this work now. And then finally, on my end, just a couple of overarching things to remember. So one is that each question on the dashboard will require bringing together multiple data elements from multiple providers using some sort of calculation. So as we talked about in the first meeting, race and ethnicity is one example of this, where different data providers and different data sets collect that information in different ways. And so when we pull the dashboard together, we'll have to combine that information. The second big picture thought is that the dashboard is intended to supplement other data sets that have been created by the data providers, not to supplant or change the content of other data sets. So we're asking questions to understand, how have some of the data already been shared in other contexts or presented in other contexts, and how can we ensure that we understand that information so that this dashboard can really complement that and we can be clear about it. And then the final thought is, the audience for the dashboard is the public. And the public and the people engaging with the dashboard may not already have a deep expertise in teacher training pipelines or underlying data sets. So we want to try to create something that people can navigate and understand intuitively without already understanding the complexities of teacher training pipelines here in California. So those are some overarching big picture thoughts. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Kathy to facilitate the more detailed discussion about the other questions. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you so much, Marianne. All right, so in our first meeting, just to sort of recap, we were looking sort of at a list of potential data points that could be applied to a set of research questions that had been identified earlier on in the process. And that was really confusing because it was hard to know which data points went with which part of which question. So when I'm working with people about developing data definitions, one of the things that I like to do is use a chemistry analogy, because my youngest kid is really into chemistry and talks to me about valence electrons at dinner. And so one of the things about chemistry is you have the periodic table, which is each of the underlying data points that might be collected by each of the data providers. And ideally, you can just grab one element, which might be earning an award, which is a relatively clean thing. But most of the time, that's not how data gets put together when we're answering research questions. Instead, it's much more like an organic chemistry equation, where there's different elements being brought together and manipulated in different ways in order to create the meaning. So part of what we tried to do between last meeting and this one is act like we're chemists, and so start to break down what are those compounds that we're bringing together to be able to answer the questions that were outlined earlier. So that said, we still need to do a couple of bits of decisions today, where we really need to make sure that we know what those elements are that we're going to be combining into our equations that are coming from each of the data providers. And we need to know which data provider is going to provide those data points, because sometimes more than one data provider is tracking something, or data providers may have slightly different definitions that they are using. And we need to make sure that we're really clear what we're going to be putting together, because as Marianne mentioned, we do need to amend the legal agreement. So there may be some cases, you may recall that Ed Sullivan had suggested that we include information about people that are in administrator training. And then I said, let's just put that in the list, even if in the end we decide we can't use it. And the reason I'm being more open and inclusive is that if we're going to amend a legal agreement, we want to have all the things that we might use, because we don't have to use them if it doesn't work out once we actually get the data in and manipulate it. The other thing that's important to remember is that we may come up with a set of definitions now. We're saying, oh yeah, we're going to pull this data element from this entity and this, and we're going to manipulate it in a particular way. And it may be that once we actually combine the data sets, we realize we need to do it slightly differently. And so just don't, it's really important to me to say that what we decide today is not inked in. We're going to be able to go back and adjust it based on what happens when the data get combined. But this at least gives the staff at C2C a running start for how they should begin to pull those elements together. So as we're going through each of these questions, again, our goal is, what are the data points that we need? Who's going to provide them? We have done some work with each of the data providers where they explained how they structure particular data points that they would be providing to the data system. And so we'll be working offline with each provider to make sure that the documentation that we have is correct. And that doesn't have to happen in these meetings. And again, we want to flag any data points that we have missed. And if there's something really important to think about in constructing those elements, this is a great time for us to capture it. My colleague Beth is going to be taking notes so that information will be available for later. So before we get started, are there any questions that people have about the process we're using or where we're at that would make it easier to dive into the content? Okay, well, go ahead and use chat also throughout the time if there's something that's coming up that you want to make sure that we're taking a look at. All right, so in a second, I'm going to switch over to another document, which we will have just to be looking at together. I apologize. Rachel, if you could pull out of the facilitator's agenda the link to that document and put it in the chat. It might be easier for people to have it up on their own screen rather than trying to get my version sized exactly correctly. So the way that this document is structured is that we started out with a list of questions that were in the documentation that went to the governing board. So some of you who may have attended the governing board meetings know that we put forward sort of a proposal that said this is the scope of the teacher training and retention dashboard. And there was a series of research questions. And I just want to acknowledge that some of the terms used in those questions may be a little bit jargony. Like there was reference to pre-service programs. And if you're confused as to what that means, what it's intended to be is teacher preparation programs or educator preparation programs. So wherever possible, what we try to do is then take that list of questions and turn them into something that was a little easier for the layperson to understand, including breaking down each of the clauses within those research questions into like things that might go together, and then saying, okay, for this concept, what are the data points and who would provide it? And then we did color coding in the document. So basically anything that's highlighted in yellow means that the Office of Cradle-to-Career does not have the data definitions at this point from the data provider. And those items are also not in the participation agreement. So there's two tasks. One is going to be verifying we want to put it in the participation agreement, and then work that needs to be done one-on-one with the data provider to get those definitions just nailed down. If it is in lavender, that means that the office does have the data definition from the provider, but that data point is not yet in the participation agreement. So we need to validate that that's the one that should be added. And then items that are in green are things where we already have data definitions, and those items are already in the participation agreement. So we're sort of good to go as long as we're validating those are the right ones to have. And then the last thing is that because we're using this, like you might think of it, if you don't want to use chemistry, you could think of it as like Lego blocks. We've got these little chunks of blocks together. So we're going to be reusing some of those Lego bricks over and over again. So we're just going to validate that we're still using that particular element. And we don't have to go into great depth. Okay, so those are the things that I thought would be helpful to know. Now I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to go ahead and reshare with that up on the screen. One moment. This is a good time for you to open up your own version using what's in the link. Okay. And I'm going to take these a little bit out of order to look at things that are similar to each other. So I thought that we'd begin with looking at teacher preparation. So there are really three different questions that are here. And what I'll be doing is making sure that we're all on the same page about which rows of the document we're looking at. So for this first one, we're going to be looking at rows 2 to 18. So one of the things that was added to the dashboard is the idea that we want to know what people were studying before they ended up in a teacher preparation program. And that is really what that blue bar is saying. And underneath it, we've got sort of the building blocks to answer that question. And the reason that we're asking this is that we want more people to go into teaching. So if we understand the pathways that people are taking before teaching, maybe we can do a better job of reaching out to those students and making sure they're aware about the opportunity to become teachers. So one other clarification I want to make is that I misspoke in the prior meeting about UC's participation. So UC will be providing information related to the prior awards of people that are in teacher preparation programs. They are going to be looking at what it would take to be able to include information about teacher preparation programs as well, but we can't get that done in this timeline. So for now, we're just going to focus on prior awards from UC, but I just didn't want to make it, I didn't want to understate UC's commitment to the work. All right, so let's just start to look at these building blocks together. So the first thing that we have to do is identify who are the students who are actually in teacher preparation programs. And you may recall that in our last meeting, we started talking about things like when people declare intent to major in something, the idea that you may not be able to get into a teacher preparation program until your junior year at CSU. So there were a lot of variations there. And what we said that we wanted to do is focus on the idea of the point at which a student is actually admitted into a teacher credential program. So you'll note we have here then 2 yellow boxes, because in addition to the idea of teaching, we added the idea of someone who's in an administrator credential program. So what I want to do is check in with our CSU colleagues about this. So Paul, what are your thoughts as you take a look at that?
Well, I recollect that conversation, and I think, Ed, you spoke up about the admit point is when someone is considered enrolled, I guess, in a teacher ed program or a educator preparation program. But are we going to be tracking continuous enrollment, or just considering people who are admitted and then complete and assuming that it's continuous enrollment throughout? Otherwise, we're going to need to track enrollment on a semester by semester basis. There are a lot of students who kind of drop out for a short time and then come back to the program when circumstances allow in their personal lives.
So maybe the way I'm seeing this one's a little different, Paul, and it covers off, I think, on where you're going, is within a given enrolled year or whatever, this admitted to a teacher credential program would be the students actually enrolled in the given term or in the given year. I don't know if we're really talking about formally moment of admissions here, Kathy. That's a different kind of question.
Okay.
That is good clarification. Thanks.
I'm having a problem, which is that a patch is getting installed on the computer that I'm presenting from. So I'm going to stop that share and I'm going to share a different screen that has that information. 1 minute. And nope. 1 more second. All right, so while I am getting my share redone. Okay, are you now seeing? Yes, that is now working. All right, I'm going to just edit directly into the document, but I will not be able to see chat. So Rochelle, if you could tell me what's going on in chat, if I'm missing it, that would be great. All right, so rather than admitted, do you just want to have this be enrolled as the name of the?
I think that's a better approach. I think you could mechanically work backwards to figure out when that student first started in whatever we're talking about, although you would, on edge cases, run into what Paul's describing, sort of a start and stop.
Well, since most of our research questions aren't looking at how long people are in teacher training programs, I don't think that that'll be an enormous issue, but being able to know every term in which someone is enrolled does mean that if those become compelling questions down the road, we could answer them.
Yeah, and again, because you're working from the record level here, right? You've got the individual and you can sort of conceptualize what that student's path is or isn't.
Right. Okay. So then we'll follow up with you, CSU's folks, to get those specific definitions nailed down.
Yeah, I would like to maintain the possibility of adding a research question down the road about the length of time it takes to complete a program, just in case, because there are teacher candidates, especially from underserved populations, who we believe take longer due to economic circumstances or personal circumstances. And it is a factor when you're trying to recruit and retain teachers of color in the profession or in the pre-service programs.
And again, I think the approach that we're sort of suggesting here with enrolled, you can do all of that because you know when they were in the program, You also know when they eventually attained their credential, understanding that we don't actually confer a credential. We recommend students for credential, and penultimately, the timing of the awarded credential or the earned credential is on the CTC side. Additionally, we have students that are going to be recommended that are outside of our enrollment catch, because they bring their materials to one of our campuses and then are forwarded through, but that's a later question, I guess.
Okay. All right.
Kathy,
So-
noting that David had a comment from CTC.
Okay. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I mean, kind of along, I think what Paul's looking or has talked about is we want to be able to look down the road to see which candidates and which kinds of candidates complete programs within, say, I don't know, a 3 or 5 year period, and which candidates do not complete programs. So is there something that we see among the candidates who are not completing programs that needs to be addressed? Or should at least be looked at?
Great. So this is the perfect way to identify data points, is when we're saying we think these are the questions we're going to have, so we make sure we've got the right things in. Then I'm going to make a correction right here, because this doesn't belong here at all, because that we aren't going to have that information yet about UC. But what we will have here then is, in addition to knowing who's enrolled in a teacher training program, we'll know which CSU they're enrolled in and what was the term in which they're enrolled. And that should be able to give us that answer the question of who's in a teacher preparation program. Am I missing any other data points that we need?
No, and I just want to say that Ed's point about the recommendation versus credential is a very good and important one, because there are candidates that we lose, whether they go work in private schools or go work out of state. And it would be good to know how many candidates are recommended but do not apply for, do not receive a credential.
Great. And we do have that further on down. So Cynthia has a question. Do you want to unmute? Or if not, Cynthia's asking about students that were in teacher preparation programs in community college. So I know that there's a lot of programs that are getting people ready to go into teacher prep programs. Could someone, maybe David, are there programs where people can finish in community college that would result in them being able to get a teaching credential?
The child development permits, yes. But as far as credentials for TK-12, no.
Okay, thank you. I couldn't find my mute button. Sorry, thank you for that response.
Right, and there was definitely a lot of interest that's been expressed, especially with the shift to universal pre-K, that would be an expansion that could happen down the road, but it wasn't prioritized for this first cut of the dashboard. But we'll make a note to take a look at how that could be addressed.
Okay, I know that they can't will not be able to obtain their credential at a community college, but I just wanted to know if that was included in your data, that there are students at the community college who are interested in becoming teachers and moving on to four-year institutions.
Yes, so
Thank
that
you.
actually is directly related to the next item on the list,
Okay.
which is this idea that we're looking backwards. So before students showed up at a CSU teacher prep program, did they do something previous, exactly like what you're describing in community college? So the idea here is that we've had to split it out, because the way the concept of an award is defined in a four-year and in a community college are different. There's also a different taxonomy used to identify the program of study in community colleges compared to four-year institutions. So we'll start with this first one, which is focused on what discipline people earned something in previously. So the first one is field of study. So for those of you who speak data points, these are going to be top codes for community colleges, zip codes for four-year institutions. So we'll know what it was they studied. And then we'll find out if they earned an award in it. So we'll only know what they studied if they finished. We're not going to try to just do all course taking. So then we would understand this issue of, for the four-year institutions, the type of four-year award that they earned, the year that they graduated, and the fact that they do have an award. Whereas in community colleges, what we're going to be looking at is this idea of there's a slightly different set of data points that are the idea that they earn some sort of award and what kind it is. So this is where you're going to get those short-term certificates for early learning, like licensure, Cynthia, that would show up, as well as people that might be doing the associate's degree. That's sort of the broad one that's sort of good for teaching prep. So all those options would be in there, as well as their graduation year. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
that's understandable. Thank you.
Okay.
Kathy, real quick clarification on that one.
Mhm.
So there's going to be cases where for students that we have in this catch, where they didn't attend a CSU, but are now attending a CSU for the credential, where we simply don't have the degrees unless they come up through one of the other channels, UC or AAICU or one of the other places where we'd get degrees in. Just wanted to make sure that was on the table. In other words, I don't have a way to capture off cleanly what the degree was prior to enrolling at the CSU if they came from outside of the CSU.
Absolutely. And that's why it's really, really important to clarify that UC is going to be contributing data to support that. The community colleges will be contributing data. Down the road, AICCU will also contribute data, but because we have to get each one of the independent colleges to enter the data system on their own, because there is no statewide data set for independent colleges, that's going to take a little bit longer. But anyway, we are attending to that. We're not expecting, the only award data that CSU would be providing would be for graduates of a CSU. So does that look like we have all the right data points to understand what students studied before they entered a teacher prep program at CSU? We'll take silence for we're good to go. All right, so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to actually switch down to the issue of the topics of the types of programs that teachers are participating in. So we're going down to row 35 to 44 now. So this was another place where I think that jargon got in the way of the research questions. So there's a number of different ways that you can slice the type of teacher preparation that is happening at CSU. So here again, and I will go through and I will make all these fixes. Everywhere it says admitted, we're going to switch this to enrolled. We have the same thing. We know where they're in school and what term it is. And then there's three things that are going to be coming from CSU using definitions that are aligned with CTC. Oh, and I'm getting a request to make this a little bit bigger. Is that better? Hopefully that'll make it a little bit
Yes,
bigger.
thank you.
Absolutely. So one is the content area. So that's whether it's a multiple subject, single subject, special or education specialist. We also have the program type, which would be a traditional, a residency, an internship, things like that. And then the types of completion evidence that's used, whether that's by assessment or by prior program participation, meaning you majored in something previously. So I just want to double check that we have the right terms here, especially for Paul, if this looks right to you, especially because we're pulling from your documentation about what the appropriate data points are to capture those concepts.
It looks right to me. Are we at the point where we want to define the values for program type, or we're just saying that we're going to capture a field of program type?
So the recommendation earlier was that whatever happens should be aligned with the definitions used by CTC. So
Okay.
I think it would be useful to just clarify, is there more work that needs to be done on CSU's part to make that alignment?
Well, I'm under the impression that CTC does not, their definition does not include residency program currently under program type. And I recommend that we change that so that it is included.
So Paul, I think where I remember we ended up was that residency programs would be based on those who receive grants or meet
Oh,
all
yeah.
the requirements for the grants.
That's right.
Yeah, so my thing on this one, when I'm looking at credential exam program or whatever that subject completion evidence, I'm not sure that I have that. I'm pretty sure that I don't. I know that we recommended the credential, but I have no evidence as to why.
So that may then come from us, because that's a required part of the recommendation that we receive, is how they pass subject matter.
And so maybe that box should be over one. I'm wondering on program type as well. While I've got ways of identifying some of these things, I'm not sure that I've got all of these things.
And I don't think we collect program type other than during surveys. Go ahead, Paul.
Well, I agree with Ed about the subject completion evidence. That is not anything that I'm aware of being collected at the system level in the CSU, but it is, as you mentioned, on the recommendation file. But program type, we in the EdQ office, it's independent from Ed's official enrollment institutional research data. We do collect a list of program completers every year from teacher prep programs that includes program type using, well, we've just been asking people to self-select residency programs, but we could clarify how we're defining residency programs and tighten that up if it's needed. But if you have it at the CTC level, that would be good. Otherwise, we can collect that in my office.
So the one challenge that we could run into with that is how we bridge the data for Cradle-to-Career, understanding that you won't have some of the connective tissue that is used with C2C in terms of the codes that are used to connect record to record.
That's true. It's possibly something that can be worked out, but there would be some effort involved and probably affects the agreements that are created or have already been signed off on.
And those are the things we learn as we do the pilot.
So what might be useful is to have a conversation between the technical representative from CSU and the staff at CTC about the options for how data can be transferred, and how that relates to things like the identity of the student and how that gets captured. So why don't we have that as an action item?
Sounds good.
Okay. So other than moving the completion evidence over to CTC as the entity providing it, are there any other issues that we want to flag? Like, for what about the content area? Is there anything there that we need to be thinking about?
On that one, Kathy, I think I can map to whatever you'd like, but I think I'm using my ERS or my enrollment reporting system variables and not CTC's definitions.
For content area?
Yeah.
So I guess the question is,
I can get you to all of those things: multiple subject, single subject, ed specialist. If you wanted the single subject that they were pursuing, which is what I suspect your penultimate goal is,
yes.
I can get down into that level of grain, but I have to do it with the CSU variable. I don't have a CTC crosswalk.
Okay, so maybe one thing that we could do is if you send us what those variables are, we can crosswalk them against what CTC has to identify if there's any discrepancies.
That's fine.
Okay. All right. Yes, Paul.
Kathy, I do have a question about that content area. There are students who are enrolled in, for example, a dual credential program. Is that an important distinction to capture? I think it's a potential data quality issue in our data set, Ed. Is that your understanding as well?
It's a data limitation. It's a data limitation
Yeah,
for
yeah.
sure in the enrolled, not in the actual recommended.
Right.
Help me understand what the implication of that is.
Well, if a student is in a ed specialist and a multiple subject dual credential program, and there are a few of those, in terms of enrollment, I don't know that we can, I don't know that our enrollment data says that they're enrolled in a dual program. It says, I think it captures one or another. They're enrolled in a credential program, and one of them is selected as the primary credential.
So we should probably, when we do the data documentation, make that clear. Because one of the reasons that we're doing this right now is that while it's all top of mind, it all gets written down. And then when we're doing the caveats and the detailed descriptions of the data elements later on, we can go back and reference this. So we'll have that in our notes.
You know, and as while we're doing that, there's other things that we'll want to collect as well, like added authorizations, like the bilingual, bicultural. That's a huge one that we'll want to be able to track.
Is that a content area?
It's something that's added on to either a multiple subject, single subject, or education specialist credential. So it's going to have kind of the same issues that Ed and Paul were just talking about, that, you know, whether their systems have a primary credential and then additional credentials or additional authorizations, I don't know, but it's something we'll need to work through.
Okay. So for CSU folks, how do you capture the bilingual component?
It's definitely a data limitation that we do not have a solid source for.
Okay. So,
Then perhaps something we should look at then is, in addition to the subject completion evidence, perhaps look at the recommendations received by the CTC, because those would have dual or, you know, multiple credentials, plus those authorizations, like bilingual, bicultural.
I'm in favor of pursuing that. I know that the bilingual added authorizations are extremely important to track, not only for bilingual and bicultural, but also some of the STEM added authorizations are important for filling shortage areas.
Yeah, computer science, definitely.
okay. So now I've got, is that accurate? So these are going to be recommendations received by CTC. So those authorizations such as STEM and bilingual, bicultural. Claudia.
Yeah, just a clarification, Kathy. Is there a need, and maybe it's already here, and it's just not jumping out at me, is are we anticipating questions that would be related to distinguishing between the number of students going through programs or completing programs and the number of credentials? That kind of gets to Paul's comment earlier, right? Because you can have one person getting multiple credentials, and that's been something difficult for us to kind of ferret out when we try to collect at the program level, not at the institutional research level, but you know, internally in our department. And that always complicates, but we're always, and there's always some confusion about that. Or is the question related to how many credentials are being awarded versus how many teachers there are? I'm sorry, it's my dryer buzzer. I'll go on mute.
No worries. That's actually a really important distinction. And it's a big problem with iPads reporting, which is always awards conferred versus human beings earning an award. And when people have more than one, then it's really hard to understand supply and demand, which is part of what we're trying to answer. So that's an excellent reason to make this extra data point be added so that we understand how many human beings there are available to do particular tasks.
So Kathy, as I was chasing through and looking at our own local definitions, I could find the bilingual, cross-culturals, the readings, the reading language, the math, early childhood specialists and other specialist areas, variety of them, going down a whole long list. If the student is not in another credential program that's being picked up as the primary. So there is a chance that in what I can pass back to you under our CSU codes, I may have it as well on enrolled students.
But it seems like, well, I guess the reason that would be valuable is we want to know who's in the pipeline in addition to who actually makes it. So it seems like we would want to have that from CSU as well to answer our pipeline questions. So what should I call that data variable?
It'll be in the content
Okay.
pile.
Okay.
So it's you've got it there as specialist already, right?
Yeah.
And that's really what we're talking about there. And it's the special, you know.
Okay. Oh, so it includes other specialists. Great. Okay. So I'm going to actually switch this back to yellow to say that we need to go back and just double check that we've got all the right documentation on it. Okay. Anything else related to the nature of the teacher prep programs?
Kathy, I'm wondering if, back on the residency piece, is there
Yeah.
work to be done to further define how residency is defined, and the CTC grant would then get translated into a field that CSU would collect? I think it's a question for Paul.
Can you
David.
repeat the question?
Yeah.
I
So
started
think,
paying more
yeah.
attention when you mentioned CSU.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I think there's a definition of residency that's in Ed Code that comes in the context of the teacher residency grant program. And I think, Paul, you were referring to the possibility of adopting that definition, if I'm tracking.
Yes.
And I wonder, is there some conversation or work to be done to further define what does that look like to translate what's in Ed Code for that particular grant program to use in a usable definition in the CSU context? If the idea is like we want to capture participation in residency that's not limited to those who are in the teacher residency grant program or receiving funds through that.
Yeah, I haven't looked at that exact definition that's currently in Ed Code, but depending on how clear and concise it is, we can just provide that definition along with our data collection instructions and have campuses identify which students are in programs that meet that definition. But have you seen the definition? It's got to be pretty clear if there's money tied to
well,
it.
so the money piece is an interesting aspect of that question and might need for a little further conversation.
Okay, well, yeah, so we need to further look into that, but it sounds promising to me.
Okay, so West Ed can take that as an action item to sort of maybe facilitate that bit of discussion if that works for everyone. Okay. All right, so now I'm going to move us down to our next topic, which is the issue of unmet demand. So this is really lines 46 to 55. So one of the questions that we want to know is if there are places where we don't have enough teachers, are there people in the pipeline sufficient to fill those gaps? So here we're going to have a lot of things that are going to be the same from what we saw up above. So I will make the corrections once again. Enrolled at a CSU campus in a particular term. What are they training for? The content code. But then the issue that we need, and this is where CDE gets to jump back in, is the question of what are the areas where there are not enough teachers? So I'm curious, has in other efforts, have people come up with a methodology for this? Does CDE have a preferred approach? How do we define that variable?
Kathy, just a quick note that Cindy from CDE just messaged me that she had to jump off.
Oh,
So we might
okay.
need to connect with, I'm not sure if we have anyone else from CDE here who can speak. But she messaged me that she just now had to jump off. So we might need to follow up with CDE one-on-one afterwards.
Okay. Then I guess I would just ask for any researchers that have been involved in this. Is there anything in particular that we should know about this, about whether there's a methodology that you've seen before, or if this is just a thing we should go straight to CDE about? Paul.
I think in addition to subjects with unmet demand, aren't there geographic locations and where there's unmet demand for certain subject areas?
So one of the variables that'll be in the drop-down menu for the dashboard is a geographic location filter. And we said earlier that it will go to the level of the school site, but no lower.
Right.
And also to the campus for the CSU. So you could go in and say, I want to look at East Bay. I want to look at the whole state. I want to look at, what's going on in this particular high school kind of thing.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So what we have been looking at so far for subjects with unmet demand are STIPs and PIPs. So permits and intern program or intern candidates who are hired on less than a full credential, which doesn't quite get at everything because sometimes districts will choose not to offer coursework or even a program like a CTE program if they can't find someone in that area. So the other place with data on that would be EdJoin, which also would not be complete because not all LEAs use EdJoin to advertise their vacancies, but that's another data point.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Okay, so we'll follow up with CDE and see what they recommend on that front. All right, so now we're going to shift
And
gears.
Kathy, if I can say, because what they have right now is district self-report. Like the number of teachers that they expect to hire the next year, and that's one measure of it, but that's not a great one if you ask me.
Okay, it's good for us to know those caveats. So I'm looking in chat. If I look to the side, I'm looking at my other monitor, and I'm seeing a comment from a member of the public saying it'd be really great to look at how many people are getting the state seal of biliteracy compared to those who are getting the bilingual credential. And one of the things that's really exciting is that the state seal of biliteracy is one of the data points that CDE has already said they're going to provide. So you could go into the query builder in the future and pull that data query and just run it and see where we're at. So thank you for reminding us that these pipelines begin early. Nothing like having an amazing teacher when you're in K-12 to make you want to become a teacher. All right, let's move on to teacher credentials. So we're now going down to row 73. And here we're going to have, or sorry, 74, we're going to have some of the same issues, which is the people that are completing programs for teacher training, getting credentialed in those shortage areas. So this is where we're getting to that question of who's actually getting recommended to go on, and they may or may not end up in certification. So what we have here is a note that CSU is going to be providing something on recommendation status, which I have down as an undefined data point right now. So curious, what is the right variable for that? And would that come out of the main CSU file, or is that coming from a special file?
So for recommended for credential is not coming from the main file, it's coming from a separate vein that we probably have. So it's an it's part of our enrollment reporting system is probably the best way to put it. And that's where most of this will come from.
Okay.
What I would say within this is you may want to flesh this out a little bit to what it is, and it's probably you're going to want to know much of what you had above, above what kind of credential it was that they were recommended for. And you're going to get multiple rows on this one, because this is where if Ed Sullivan knocked out 3 credentials during the course of a calendar year, not a calendar year, a fiscal year starting July 1st, running through June 30th,
Mhm.
Ed will show with all of the different credentials and or certificates recommended, or certifications recommended within that year.
And Kathy, I'll offer that it might be easier in the long run to use the data we have on recommendations. Because, as we look forward, it won't just be CSU, it'll also be the UC system and then all of the privates.
Mhm.
So if CTC already has all of that data, I think it'll be a lot easier, to have consistent data coming just from the recommendations we receive, rather than having everyone have to report it, all the preparation programs report it themselves.
So there's 2 ways to go about this. So one is you have a rule set that says, if found in CTC data set, use that value. If not found, use the CSU value. And that would allow us to answer questions about people that are getting recommendations but are somehow not showing up at teacher credentialing, which actually seems like an important potential gap in the pipeline. Like, I'm just imagining somebody saying, oh, I really wanted to be a teacher, but I just couldn't afford to buy in my hometown, and I ended up moving to Nevada because I could afford to live there. And so being able to, like, we don't know for sure where people have gone, but it would give us more information. So is it worth having both data points, although we might privilege the CTC data point if available?
Well, theoretically, there should not be any CSU recommendations that we do not have.
Okay.
I
So-
believe the distinction you're getting to, Kathy, is there's a small distinction between completing the credential program and being recommended for a credential. There are some credential requirements that are the responsibility of the individual, not the program. Some assessments, for example, and there is a small number of people who end up completing the program but not being recommended.
Good
And
point.
we don't have a good marker for that one at all. I don't have one that says Ed completed but didn't get recommended. So there's not a completed coursework variable that I can point to in the data that I have.
Right, and that's the data collection that we do in-house internally for our own purposes.
I ask aloud, and really for my CTC colleague, if we're recommending the credential, is there any case where you would not award it?
If there is something that comes up on the background check, hopefully that should have been found already. But if there's anything new, Fifi, you're here. Is there anything else you can think of why we would not?
No, I think it's what you probably said is the fingerprinting, any rejections that our Department of Practices may have found out.
So should we be moving recommendation status and credential recommendation type both over to CTC rather than CSU?
I don't have a problem with that if you're comfortable with it. In the end, it is the reflection of where it's occurring. I imagine that CTC has all of the various other pieces, especially around single subject, of what's actually being conferred. So yeah, I suspect you've got enough right there.
And then, do you know which campus they attended for the CTC data set?
Yeah, we would.
Although that is not in your data sharing agreement. So now we gotta do that, and then the date. And that's one that you also have for CTC.
Yes, we would have that as well.
Right. You'll note that I did do some cross-hatching here. This had to do with an earlier conversation I had with Ed Sullivan. I didn't want to change the rows in case people were using row numbers internally, which is why it's still there. All right. So then going down, the only thing that we're dealing with here then is the subjects of unmet demand, which is the same issue that we're going to go back and revisit separately. So
Yeah,
is there anything?
Kathy, sorry, on that one, I think I heard David suggesting that one way to get at that is through those who are teaching on permits and waivers and potentially intern credentials. And that would be at CTC. David, correct me if I'm getting that wrong.
Nope, that's exactly right. And that's what LPI reports on, and that's what we report on as well.
And I think your recommendation is that may be the most, the best metric we have for that particular row.
Is that the recommendation?
That would be my recommendation. I mean, I still would love to see what we can learn from EdJoin as well, but that's a whole other ball of wax.
Okay, so I'm going to leave this yellow square here because CDE is not here to answer that question, but we'll follow up with them separately and see what their thoughts are. And thank you, Melissa, for making sure I didn't miss that point. Okay, so anything else on this one? Then the next one we're going to do is training type, which is basically row 97. So this is where we're just trying to understand the difference between different ways that people end up becoming teachers, like the difference between residency and stuff like that. So here we're going to move recommendation status. It looks like we probably want to also include that same row about the the credential recommendation type in this one. So hold on one second. I'm going to just move this over so it's consistent. And we're also having the idea that they have earned a credential. And so I apologize, David, I think that I was missing stuff in the documentation. What should we call that idea of people who earned a teaching credential? What is the name of that variable?
I would call it awarded a credential because, I mean, the recommendation really is the earn. Or either awarded or issued. And so what data are you asking about that one?
We basically just want to know who it is who got a credential.
Okay.
And what just the name of that variable is in your data set. Or a shorthand for it that we could use in the participation agreement.
Fifi, any idea? I mean, like credential issue date or
it could be the
number?
application type or application status, because we use granted to indicate that the credential has been issued, and we have document status, which will indicate whether it is valid or not. So whenever we look at credentials issue, we do use application status and document status.
Do I need to add something else here about document status as another variable?
Yeah, it's just to ensure that the credential is valid.
Okay. Okay. All right, then type of pre-service program. I apologize. What did we decide about that one? We left that with CSU. So I'll go down and change that one. Okay, anything else about whether the people who actually get credentials varies by the type of program they participated in? Okay. And then the next one has to do with how they demonstrated their competency. And so here we again have people who are earning a credential. So I will replicate what we have up here. And then the issue is just whether they were that emergency waiver intern, preliminary clear. So does that seem like the right way to clarify how people are qualifying for their credentials?
If I'm looking at that title, demonstrating subject matter competency, I mean, that would be based on the recommendation that we talked about previously. Because the recommendation identifies, you know, which way they met subject competence. And the credential type seems to be different than that, but I'm wondering if there was some interest in whether someone had a waiver or intern credential before they earn their preliminary.
So how should I edit this? I guess, is this a different variable? Am I using the wrong name, or what should we do here?
So the subject matter competency is going to be in the recommendation, and it's going to be for a recommendation for a preliminary credential. So the recommendation, I'm thinking out loud here, the recommendation is only for preliminary credentials. So I'm not sure if there's interest in collecting data regarding previous credentials or credentials issued previous to the preliminary. Did someone start on a waiver or an intern before they got their preliminary? I mean, is that something that we want to look at?
So my memory of this discussion when we were first talking about this, which would have been more than a year and a half ago, was that there was that question about how many people do we actually have who haven't had the benefit of full training, who are deployed in the field. And so it was just really trying to figure out, like, are we in such a crisis that we're basically having a whole other way that people become teachers? And that was the policy issue that people were trying to understand. There's probably a lot of more nuance in that discussion. So I guess what's important is if we're imagining that these are members of the public that are who are saying, like, I just feel like my kid's math teacher doesn't know anything about classroom management, like what's happening, that they'd be able to go here and be able to see, is it really prevalent that we're asking people to teach without providing them the type of training they probably need?
Does that issue belong under this heading of in row 101 or elsewhere?
What would you recommend?
I gotta get the elsewhere organized. I was just reacting in particular to David's point that it doesn't seem kind of to squarely fit under this question of demonstration of subject matter competency. But yeah, give me a second, or anyone else, feel free to chime in.
So for me, and it's more of a question than anything else, if I were to get a credential, single subject in science, am I automatically going to get a clear credential, or is it possible that I am one of those other three things. And if I'm one of those other three things, then the case is probably made for keeping it here.
So once you complete a preparation program, you receive a preliminary credential. And then to move on to the clear, you have to complete, BITSA or induction program, a clear credential program. So that requires at least 2 years of service.
And so what this really does is give you a gradation on a subject matter credential, almost certainly. Same thing true on multiple subjects?
Yes, multiple subject and education specialist as well.
Okay, and so what you're really getting is the gradation of whatever credential you're looking at within this category, which I think is really getting at what you have here. You could imagine a chart that shows that most of the pick the topic faculty are in preliminary, waiver, emergency, or intern rather than clear. That suggests that you've got an area where you're underperforming perhaps in terms of knowledge across the state. In other words, breadth. You could get the entire opposite, at which point you've got no pipeline coming forward. You've got everyone meeting the standard.
I guess I'm thinking because this says subject matter, I agree with Melissa that it probably belongs somewhere else, but I couldn't tell you where. Let me look as well.
What's most important for us to do today, rather than think about how it gets organized, is to be clear what the data points are to answer the research question. So Ed really made this very, very clear, which is if what we're trying to understand is the pipeline, and either like everybody's good to go and you don't have anyone in the prep area, or everybody's like just figuring it out and they haven't made it to their 2-year mark, that's really, it helps us understand better what's going on.
Yeah, it's kind of a question about, the general question is about how do we understand shortages?
Mm-hmm.
And getting, it kind of relates to the earlier conversations about unmet demand. But Kathy, I think you're urging us not to get too worried about where this fits and just get the data element clarified for now.
Yes, please.
Well, maybe it's about what does the staff of an LEA look like or school look like? What percentage of teachers have clear credentials? What percentage have preliminary, intern, and waiver? And maybe that's what this is getting at.
Mm-hmm.
So if that's what we're going to be looking at, do we have the right variable listed?
Credential type, yes, but what we would need related to that is from CDE, the employment status.
Okay.
So we need to know who's employed from CDE, and then CTC can tell you what kind of credential they hold.
Okay. And the good news is that's actually on their list.
Yes.
So we're good to go there. Awesome. Okay. Anything else we need to do other than the fixes that I've listed here?
I probably shouldn't bring up misassignments, but I don't know. I mean, if we're talking about employment, one of the things that is kind of new is we work with the CDE to identify whether every teacher assignment in the state is properly credentialed or if it's some kind of a misassignment.
We've got a question further on down about that, which will be
Okay.
in the next meeting, which is good since CDE is not here.
Okay, and Kathy, just so you've got it when you cycle back, I included a link to that dashboard that CDE has up
Okay.
in the chat, and it is specific to all of the various elements of quality or quality indicators of the type of instructor in the room.
Okay. Thank you. We'll take a look at that and make sure we've got it integrated before our next meeting. Okay, so one last topic, 3 questions that are looking at this from different ways, which is the alignment of the people who are training to be teachers compared with the students in particular areas. So we start actually all the way back up at row 19, don't get dizzy here, which is the people who are entering pre-service programs. Are they aligned with our student population? So again, we're going to have to fix this right here, because we're going to put in the thing about it being the enrolled. And then we know which campus they're at. Oops, and here once again, I shouldn't have anything for UC. So I'm just going to get that out of there. So we know who they are, who are enrolled, where they are, and then we know things about their demographics. So while we were preliminarily looking at race and ethnicity, the issue of sex and gender also came up. So we thought we would just add it into the possible data points. So we will know what people's, oh, I know, no, my apologies, why that was there, is that, these are the two that don't belong there. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be reconciling things about individuals across data sets. So one of the things that's really interesting, like we're hearing in iPad's presentation about this, is that things that we perceive as immutable, like race, actually change in data sets over time. And so we'll be having to do, as part of the master data management, something that's going on where we are taking a look at those identities. We actually, in our previous work, came up with a methodology for deciding when you have multiple values, which one you would assign to an individual. So just, this is going to create a little bit of discrepancy with dashboards that might be created by individual institutions. I'm thinking, for example, CSU does a lot of work in this area, because the race and ethnicity of your individual students may end up being reassigned compared to the value that you have based on the methodology used in Cradle-to-Career. But basically, we will then match that information about the ethnicity of the person who's in the program against the students themselves. So are there any concerns or questions about this general approach for looking at that alignment question? Yes,
Well, I understand the need to have some business rules about where to capture race, ethnicity, and sex, gender, and on other demographic information. I am a little concerned about discrepancies in data dashboards in different places. And if there's a data sharing agreement and a decision made that these demographic characteristics are going to be this authoritative source is somewhere outside the CSU, then I would love it if the data sharing agreements allow those data to flow back to the CSU so we could update our dashboards. No? Help me understand, because I am concerned about people looking at dashboards in multiple places, seeing discrepancies and discounting all the dashboards.
By nature, the C2C data set will be incomplete. You will not get a 100% match on anything as you go through this. So there will be records that fall out. The other thing is you can't account for the dynamic nature of choices made by C2C to define what we federally are required to report. And so all of those things, you're going to find that some of these dashboards, in theory, could become like windmills, or a stopwatch. Every day it'll be right twice, but the rest of the day it might not be. In terms of what you're looking at, you do not have the capacity to backflow all of these things back into your system and come up with new versions of things that the CSU has taken approaches on already. It's not in our best interest to try to resolve those edge cases that will merge from what Kathy's describing. Most of the records, the core records, will stay pretty clean, straight up the middle. And percentage-wise, you're probably looking at tenths to hundredths of a percentage point changes. Numerically, you might be looking at tens to 100 best case on a large data set.
Okay, that makes sense. I do think points to a need for both communications and resources for end users, just to make sure that any potential discrepancies are kind of, or data limitations in a given dashboard are kind of clear to the user.
So during the planning process, this was an area of considerable concern because, for example, there's a second task force that's running right now, which has to do with defining earnings. And every single one of the post-secondary segments has a different methodology that's used. And so there's no way that we can make something that's going to match what everybody does, because it just isn't going to be the same. And there's no, again, this goes back to the idea that C2C isn't forcing anybody to change what they do in their native system, because there's a reason that you may be doing something that way, like federal reporting that C2C is not on the hook for. And so I'm raising this now just because there may be places where this will become really complicated. And so being aware at this early date, where there's going to have to be a lot of work with users, a lot of careful professional development constructed, is like never too early to flag that, even though we're being data wonky right now. All of us who work with data know that as soon as there's a number that's a little bit different, it's a great reason for somebody to say that they don't believe anything at all. And that's one of the things that the data system will have to work against.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, so then we basically have 4 versions of the same question. So one is at the point of entry. And then if you scroll down to 56 or 57, it gets it to people that are finishing programs. And we've decided it's going to be when they're getting, recommended. And then at the point of getting the credential. So I want to go back, because we were saying that we wanted to have the recommendation data come from CTC. Does that mean we don't need both of these questions because it's essentially the same thing? Because the only, what we just heard from Fifi was that it's only going to be different if there was like a background check and somebody doesn't make it all the way through. I'm going out on a limb here. Would it actually, is this the place where we go back and we look at that issue of people's credential status, whether they're an emergency credential or if they're in the clear, instead of looking at the difference between recommended and awarded a credential? Or is that not an interesting question in particular?
I think it's potentially of interest that if there are people who, if there's a particular group that for some reason is being represented, but is less likely to actually follow through and get their apply for and receive their credential, then it might be helpful. I'm not, but if it's such a small number, maybe it's not valuable.
Is there anyone else on the committee or the task force sort of interested in that question? Or is it best just to collapse these two and make it simpler? Since I'm not hearing anyone speak up and say they're really eager for it, I'm going to then recommend that we just collapse it and go to people that are getting awarded the credential and not do the people being recommended.
I want to argue against simpler.
You want to argue against simpler?
No, I won't.
Oh, you won't. Okay.
Simpler.
All right. So I'll make those edits. And then the last one had to do with the location, which was the question that was raised earlier, which is whether that alignment is varying by location. So I'm just going to edit this to, again, reflect what we did above. And so it just, the idea is that we're going to have that ability to sort by region. All All right, and that was the list of topics that we were going to cover today. Is there anything else that is sort of nagging in the back of somebody's mind that they want to raise now before I go in and fix this documentation?
I don't think it affects the documentation per se, but I do want to point out that, that although it's important for the demographic composition of the teacher workforce to reflect the students that they're teaching, it's also important if you're in a school that's a relatively homogeneous student population, it's important for them to have exposure to teachers from diverse backgrounds. And that's not necessarily explicit in the research question, but I think it's important to be aware of.
And maybe depending on that and reflecting on career, student bodies turn over quicker than faculty bodies. And so you can imagine if a person who got their credential 25 years ago, who's been teaching third grade, the third graders that have come through from that community may look very different than what they did initially. You don't really have a way to or conceptualize that in the data sets you've got, is sort of how length of career or something that gives you an indicator of how long in career or where in career. So if I've got an offset on this question, the first thing I'm going to ask you is do I just have a teaching body that's been there an extended period, or is this a school that's revolving its teaching body and or something else? In other words, can I be reflective if there's no opportunities to fill chairs with new people?
So next meeting, what we're going to be doing is really digging into the questions about teacher placement and teacher retention. And that one of the things that we talked about in the planning process is that sometimes it's really important to contextualize student outcomes in the institutional factors. So if you are being taught in a school where there's an incredibly high level of turnover of relatively new teachers who haven't had the benefit as much training, that might influence sort of learning outcomes for students. And so I think that adding this question in is something to discuss expressly, of looking at sort of tenure as a research question, I think would be a good thing for us to add. And we can talk it through with the full group next time.
And Kathy, I apologize. And maybe so we're not to 109, we'll talk about it next time. As just a thought holder here, I just read the word newly there. So just conceptualize what you mean by newly within 109. If you do that, maybe we have a good jump point to start from.
Great. We will use that then as the way to have that discussion. But I really want CDE here for that part of it, because now we're really into their realm. Well, great. All right, so we've got 4 minutes left and we're basically done with that part of the agenda. So sort of what we had remaining was to clarify next steps. So what we'll be doing is going through and updating the documentation. I will be sending the link back out. This is a Google Doc, so folks can go in and see where things are at in advance of our next meeting, which will focus more on the retention elements. So I apologize. I'm supposed to be projecting the PowerPoint, but I don't have it up on the other computer. So I don't know, Mary Ann, do you want to just sort of close us out?
Sure, I'm happy to. I'm trying to see, I'm not going to succeed in displaying the last slide here, but it basically just said that one sentence, right? We're going to discuss the other data points that Kathy just mentioned in the next meeting. So just 2 reflections here at the end real quick. First of all, thank you again for being here and working through all of these questions with us. I think the question that I just wanted to circle back to one point that Paul had raised, which is that inevitably, the dashboards that we put together are going to display information in slightly different ways than it's already being displayed. And I think, in addition to what Kathy said, there's a real opportunity for us to use the input from our advisory boards, from community members, including those of you who are dialing in and listening into this conversation, to really help shape how we go about the challenging task of keeping our dashboards really clean and understandable, but with the appropriate caveats so that people can understand why the Cradle-to-Career dashboards that are bringing together data across many different entities might have slightly different numbers than reports on similar topics done by individual entities for specific reporting purposes. So that's just something where I'd really welcome input from community members, from all of you on the task force, to keep thinking about that challenge and the opportunity we have to try to be as clear as possible from the outset about how the choices we made and how we're defining different data points in a way that's really understandable to people, even if they haven't been a part of all of these conversations and they don't spend their days digging around in data sets as many of us on this call do. So I just wanted to reflect on that and mention that I think there's a real opportunity for us to help share the message that just because things are slightly different in different formats doesn't mean that it's less reliable. So welcome input on that. And thank you for engaging with us in this work. Really appreciate it. And many thanks to Kathy for facilitating the conversation and guiding us through all of these questions. All right. Thank you, everyone.